The sun was just beginning to set over the small village outside Seoul, painting the sky in gentle strokes of orange and pink. Minji sat on the worn wooden steps of her family's modest home, watching her father trudge up the dirt path from the rice fields. Even from a distance, she could see the weariness in his shoulders. At 9 years old, she understood more than most children her age about struggle. "Did you finish your studies?" her mother called from inside, where she was preparing their simple dinner of kimchi and rice. Less rice than usual these days. "Yes, Mama," Minji replied, though her notebook remained unopened in her lap. Her thoughts had been elsewhere again. 3 weeks ago, while running errands with her mother at the community center, she had discovered something that changed everything. In the back corner of the large room where village meetings were held, partially covered by a faded cloth, stood an old upright piano. Minji had never seen one up close before, only in the occasional television program when the electricity was working. That day, while her mother chatted with the center coordinator, Minji had slipped away and pulled back the cloth. The wooden surface was dusty, but something about it called to her. Carefully, she pressed one of the white keys. The clear note that rang out sent a shiver down her spine. Before she knew what was happening, her small fingers were dancing across the keys, creating sounds that somehow felt right together, though she had no idea what she was doing. "Minji." Her mother's sharp voice had startled her. "Don't touch things that aren't yours. Come now." That brief encounter had awakened something in Minji that wouldn't go back to sleep. Every day since, she had found reasons to pass by the community center, peering through windows, hoping for a chance to touch those keys again. "Dinner's ready," her mother called, breaking into her thoughts. Inside, the family of 4 gathered around their small table. Minji's younger brother Junho was already seated, swinging his legs impatiently. Their father washed his hands in the basin by the door, the dirt from the fields leaving cloudy swirls in the water. "The rice crop isn't looking good," her father said quietly to her mother when he thought the children weren't listening. "The rain came too late. If prices go up again," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Minji had overheard enough of these conversations to understand that money was always tight. And sometimes it got even tighter. Later that night, after Junho had fallen asleep on the thin mattress they shared, Minji lay awake, listening to the night sounds of the village, distant dogs barking, the occasional motor scooter passing on the main road, and the soft whispers of her parents still discussing money problems. The next day after school, instead of heading straight home, Minji took a detour to the community center. She peered through the window and saw the main room was empty. Heart racing, she tried the door, unlocked. This was her chance. The piano sat in the same spot, still partly covered. Minji approached it reverently, as if it were a sleeping creature she didn't want to startle. She slid onto the bench, which was too high for her small frame, and placed her fingers on the keys just as she had before. What happened next was hard to explain. Minji didn't know any songs or how to read music, but somehow, her fingers found patterns that sounded right to her ears. She experimented with pressing keys together, finding combinations that made her feel something deep inside. Sometimes happy, sometimes sad, but always something powerful. She lost track of time, lost in this new world of sound she was creating, until the sudden click of the door made her jump up in fright. "What are you doing in here, child?" It was Mrs. Song, the elderly woman who helped maintain the community center. Minji stood frozen, certain she was in trouble. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I just wanted to play." Mrs. Song's stern expression softened slightly. "You weren't just banging on it like most children would. Were you actually playing something?" Minji shook her head.
"I don't know how to play."
"I was just trying to make nice sounds." Mrs. Song studied her for a moment. "My husband used to play years ago before his hands got too stiff with age. That's his piano. He donated it to the center when we couldn't keep it at home anymore." She paused, considering. "If you really want to learn, you can come when the center is open. And if no one needs the main room, I won't chase you away." Minji's face lit up with a smile so bright it seemed to illuminate the dim room. "Really, thank you, Mrs. Song. I promise I'll be careful with it." "See that you are," Mrs. Song replied, but there was a hint of warmth in her voice. "Now go on home before your parents worry." Minji raced home, her heart soaring with excitement. She wanted to tell everyone about the piano, but something held her back. Her parents were already worried about money and making sure she focused on her schoolwork. They might not understand this new passion, so she kept her secret, planning to visit the piano whenever she could. Over the next few weeks, Minji developed a routine. After school, she would finish her chores as quickly as possible, then tell her mother she was going to study with her friend Soo-jin. Instead, she would rush to the community center, where Mrs. Song would nod at her before returning to her own work. At first, Minji just experimented, pressing different combinations of keys, listening carefully to how they sounded together. But one afternoon, everything changed. An old television in the corner of the room was playing softly, some cultural program from Seoul. A woman in a long black dress sat at a grand piano, her fingers moving gracefully across the keys. The melody that filled the room was the most beautiful thing Minji had ever heard. "What is that?" she asked Mrs. Song, pointing to the television. Oh, that's Chopin, a famous composer. She's playing his nocturne." Minji watched, mesmerized, until the piece ended. Then, to Mrs. Song's astonishment, she turned to the old upright piano and began to play, not perfectly, but recognizably, the same melody she had just heard. Mrs. Song's teacup clattered onto its saucer. "Child, have you been taking lessons somewhere?" Minji shook her head, still playing, working out the notes by ear, fixing her mistakes as she went. "I just listened to how it sounded." Mrs. Song watched in amazement as this small girl who had never had a lesson in her life picked out Chopin by ear after hearing it just once. It wasn't perfect. Her small hands couldn't reach all the necessary spans, and she missed some of the complex harmonies, but it was extraordinary nonetheless. From that day on, Minji became obsessed with learning every piece of music she could hear. Mrs. Song brought in an old radio, and Minji would listen to the classical station whenever possible, then try to recreate what she heard. Her progress was remarkable. Within months, she was playing recognizable versions of pieces that would challenge students with years of formal training. But while her musical world was expanding, life at home was getting harder. The poor harvest her father had feared became reality. Rice prices rose, and Minji noticed the portions at dinner growing smaller. Her parents spoke in worried whispers late into the night. Her father took on extra work in the city, leaving before dawn and returning long after dark, the lines on his face deepening with each passing week. Minji began to feel guilty about her secret piano sessions. She was spending hours playing music while her family struggled. What use were beautiful sounds when her brother went to bed with a hungry stomach? But each time she considered stopping, something inside her rebelled. The music had become as necessary to her as breathing. One evening, as Minji was helping her mother prepare dinner, now just soup with a few vegetables and a small amount of rice, she gathered her courage. "Mama," she said hesitantly, "what if I could help? With money, I mean." Her mother looked at her with surprise. "You're a child, Minji. Your job is to study hard so you can have a better life someday. But what if I can do something now?" Minji persisted. "Something I'm good at?" Curiosity sparked in her mother's tired eyes. "What are you talking about?" Minji took a deep breath. It was time to reveal her secret. "I can play piano. Mrs. Song at the community center has been letting me practice on the old one there." "I'm really good, Mama. Mrs. Song says so too." Her mother looked confused. "Piano? We can't afford piano lessons." "I haven't had lessons," Minji explained. "I taught myself. I can play songs after hearing them just once." Her mother set down the knife she was using to chop vegetables, wiping her hands on her apron. There was skepticism in her eyes, but also a hint of something else. Worry, perhaps. "Minji, we don't have time for fantasies. Times are hard right now." "It's not a fantasy," Minji insisted, her voice rising with frustration. "I can show you." Her mother sighed. "Not now. Your father will be home soon and dinner isn't ready." Minji felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had thought her mother would be proud, would see this as a solution. Instead, she was being dismissed, her newfound passion treated like a child's silly game. That night, as she lay beside her sleeping brother, Minji made a decision. Words weren't enough. She would have to show them what she could do. And somehow, she would find a way to use this gift to help her family. She just needed a chance to prove herself. As she drifted off to sleep, her fingers moved silently, playing invisible keys, her mind filled with music and determination. Tomorrow she would begin figuring out how a 9-year-old girl with an unusual talent could make a difference. Her family had always taken care of her. Now perhaps it was time for her to help take care of them. 5 years passed like the changing seasons. Minji was 14 now, her fingers longer and more skilled on the piano keys, her understanding of music deeper. The old upright piano at the community center had become her closest friend, its ivory keys worn smooth in the places her fingers touched most often. Mrs. Song had become her unofficial guardian in this musical journey. Though not a pianist herself, she had a deep appreciation for music and had managed to find old music books and recordings for Minji. Sometimes she would sit quietly in the corner, eyes closed, listening as Minji played pieces by composers whose names the girl could now pronounce. Beethoven, Mozart, Chopin. "You play from somewhere deep," Mrs. Song told her once, "like you're telling a story only your heart knows." Minji treasured these rare compliments. At home, her parents had come to accept her piano playing as a hobby, but nothing more. Her father would nod tiredly when she tried to explain a new piece she had learned, his mind clearly on the next day's work. Her mother would occasionally say, "That's nice, dear," but would quickly remind her not to neglect her studies. Only her brother Jun-ho showed genuine excitement. At 11, he had appointed himself her manager and biggest fan. "When you're famous," he would say, "I'll handle all your concerts. We'll travel the world." Minji would laugh and ruffle his hair. "First, I need to learn how to play properly. Real pianists have teachers and grand pianos, not just old books and a worn-out upright." But their family's financial situation had not improved much over the years. If anything, it had become more precarious. A development company had purchased much of the farmland near their village to build new housing for Seoul's expanding population. Minji's father had lost his regular field work and now took whatever odd jobs he could find, often traveling hours away to construction sites. That spring brought unusually heavy rains, causing flooding that damaged many homes in their village, including their own. The family had spent what little savings they had on repairs. Minji overheard her parents late one night, discussing whether they could afford to keep both children in school. "Junho is younger," her father said quietly. "Minji is smart enough to find work now and she could return to school later." The thought of leaving school filled Minji with dread. Not because she loved studying, though she did well enough, but because school days meant structure, which allowed her to plan her piano time. If she had to work full days, when would she play? The next day after school, she walked slowly to the community center, her mind heavy with worry. She sat at the piano but couldn't bring herself to play. For the first time, music couldn't lift her spirits. "Why so glum?" Mrs. Song asked, setting a cup of tea beside her on the piano bench. Minji explained her family's situation, ending with, "I need to find work, but I don't know what I can do. I'm not trained for anything." Mrs. Song considered this, her weathered hands wrapped around her own teacup, except piano. Minji shook her head. "No one pays a 14-year-old village girl to play piano, especially one without proper training." "Perhaps," Mrs. Song said thoughtfully. "But you're not just any 14-year-old girl, are you? You have a gift." That night, Minji couldn't sleep. Mrs. Song's words kept circling in her mind. Did she really have a gift that could be valuable to others? She'd never thought of her playing as anything more than personal joy. The idea that it might help her family seemed far-fetched. Then she remembered something. Last year, during a rare family trip to Seoul to visit her mother's cousin, they had passed a fancy restaurant with large windows. Through the glass, Minji had spotted a grand piano in the corner, where a man in a black suit played while people dined at tables covered with white cloths. Her father had noticed her staring and commented, "Imagine being paid just to play music while people eat." An idea began to form in Minji's mind. Bold, perhaps foolish, but it was the only plan she had. The next morning was Saturday, so there was no school. Minji woke early and put on her best clothes, a simple blue dress her mother had made for special occasions. She brushed her long black hair until it shone and borrowed a small amount of her mother's precious face powder to hide a pimple on her chin. "Where are you going so dressed up?" her mother asked, looking up from where she was patching Junho's school pants. Minji took a deep breath. "I'm going to find a job." Her mother's face softened with concern. "Oh, Minji, I know you heard your father and me talking, but you don't need to worry about adult matters. I'm not a child anymore, Minji replied, surprising herself with her firm tone. And we're a family. We help each other. Before her mother could argue, Minji left, walking quickly toward the bus stop that would take her to the nearby city. She had saved just enough money from New Year gifts over the years to afford the round-trip fare. The city was busier than she remembered, streams of people flowing in every direction, the noise and energy overwhelming after the quiet of her village. Minji clutched the small bag containing her sheet music and walked purposefully, trying to look like she belonged there. She had a destination in mind, Golden Dragon, an upscale restaurant she had researched at the school's computer lab. It was known for hosting business dinners and special occasions. And most importantly, it had a piano. She had confirmed this through photos on their website. Standing outside the restaurant, Minji's courage nearly failed her. Through the windows, she could see elegant tables, wealthy-looking patrons, and staff in crisp uniforms. The piano sat in the corner, a beautiful black grand, far larger and certainly better maintained than the one she was used to. It was currently unoccupied. Minji smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and pushed open the door. A young woman at the entrance counter looked up, her expression quickly changing from professional welcome to slight confusion at the sight of a teenage girl alone. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting Minji might be in the wrong place. "I would like to speak with the manager." "Please," Minji said, grateful her voice didn't shake. The woman seemed about to refuse, but something in Minji's determined expression made her hesitate. "One moment," she said, disappearing into the back. Minji stood awkwardly in the entrance, aware of curious glances from nearby diners. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man appeared, his hair graying at the temples, wearing a well-tailored suit. "I'm Mr. Park, the manager. What can I do for you, young lady?" His tone was polite but reserved. Minji straightened her shoulders. "My name is Minji, and I would like to play your piano." Mr. Park blinked in surprise. "I beg your pardon? I noticed your piano isn't being used right now." Minji continued quickly. "I'm a pianist, and I thought perhaps your customers might enjoy some music with their meals." A flicker of amusement crossed Mr. Park's face. Behind him, several staff members had paused their work to listen, exchanging glances and subtle smiles. "We occasionally hire professional musicians for special events," Mr. Park explained slowly, as if to a child. "We're not currently looking for entertainment." Minji felt her cheeks burning but pressed on. "Could I audition?" "Just one song." "I won't charge anything for today," one of the waiters snickered, quickly covering it with a cough. Mr. Park shot him a stern look before turning back to Minji. "Young lady, this is a high-end establishment. Our clients expect a certain level of sophistication." His eyes took in her homemade dress and simple appearance. Minji felt something shift inside her. Embarrassment, giving way to a quiet determination. She reached into her bag and pulled out the sheet music for Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The first piece she had ever heard on television years ago and now one of her favorites. "I understand," she said quietly. "But music speaks for itself, doesn't it? If your customers don't like my playing, I'll leave immediately." Mr. Park seemed about to refuse again when an older man appeared beside him, tall, with silver hair and an air of authority that made even Mr. Park straighten slightly. "What's happening here, Park?" the older man asked. "Nothing to concern yourself with, Mr. Lee. Just a young visitor I was about to see out." Mr. Lee studied Minji with sharp eyes. "You want to play our piano?" Minji nodded. "Yes, sir. I can play very well." She hesitated, then added, "I wouldn't ask for money today, but if people enjoy it, perhaps we could discuss an arrangement. Even just for rice." "Rice?" Mr. Lee repeated, eyebrows rising. Minji's face flushed deeper. "My family. We're having a difficult time right now. If I could bring home something for our table, it would help." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Honesty overcoming pride. Several of the staff were openly laughing now, though they tried to hide it behind hands or turned heads. "May I play for rice?" one whispered to another, setting off fresh snickers. Mr. Lee silenced them with a glance. He studied Minji for another long moment, then nodded sharply. "One piece," he said. "Let's hear what you can do." Minji could hardly believe it. As Mr. Lee led her to the piano, she was aware of the stares following them, some curious, some amused, some disapproving. The grand piano was even more beautiful up close, its surface gleaming under the restaurant's elegant lighting. She sat on the bench, adjusting its height, and placed her hands on the keys. They felt different from her familiar upright, more responsive, the action smoother. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes briefly, and began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne filled the restaurant, soft and delicate. Minji felt the familiar sense of falling into the music, the world around her fading as her fingers found their way through the piece she knew so well. She didn't need the sheet music she'd brought. This melody lived in her heart. She didn't see the gradual change in the room, the conversations that trailed off mid-sentence, the waiters who paused with trays in hand, the diners who set down their chopsticks to listen. She didn't see Mr. Lee's expression transform from skepticism to astonishment, or Mr. Park's mouth falling slightly open in surprise. Minji was somewhere else entirely, letting the music carry her, putting everything she felt, her family's struggles, her own dreams, her love of the piano, into each note. When the final chords faded into silence, she kept her eyes on the keys for a moment, returning slowly to reality. Then she looked up, and what she saw made her breath catch. The restaurant had fallen completely silent. Every eye was fixed on Minji, expressions ranging from surprise to wonder. She felt her face grow hot under their stares and quickly looked down at the piano keys again. Then, from a table near the window, someone began to applaud. Others joined in, the sound swelling until it filled the room. Minji looked up in disbelief. These elegant city people with their fine clothes and important jobs were clapping. For her, Mr. Lee, who had been standing motionless beside the piano, finally spoke. "Where did you learn to play like that?" His voice was quiet, almost reverent. Minji twisted her fingers together in her lap. "I taught myself mostly. At the community center in my village. We have an old piano there. Self-taught?" Mr. Park had appeared at Mr. Lee's side, his earlier dismissiveness replaced with something like awe. That's extraordinary." A well-dressed woman approached from a nearby table. "Young lady, are you available for private events? My daughter is getting married next month and we've been looking for a pianist." Before Minji could answer, another diner called out, "Play something else." Soon others were joining in, requesting another piece. Minji looked uncertainly at Mr. Lee, who nodded slightly. Taking a deep breath, she positioned her hands and began to play Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 16 in C major, another piece she had practiced countless times on the old upright piano. As she played, waiters resumed their duties, diners returned to their meals, but the atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. Conversations were quieter, more subdued, as if no one wanted to miss a note. Minji felt something unfamiliar stirring inside her. Pride, yes, but also a sense of rightness, as if she had finally found where she belonged. When she finished the second piece, the applause was even more enthusiastic. Mr. Lee bent down to speak quietly in her ear. "Can you stay until closing? Play whatever you like, with short breaks when you need them." He hesitated, then added, "We'll pay you properly, of course, not just in rice." A small smile softened his face. "Though we can certainly include that too, if you wish." Minji nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. She hadn't expected any of this, had prepared herself for rejection or at best grudging permission to play a few songs. The thought of staying all evening, of being paid properly, was beyond anything she had dared to hope. As the evening progressed, Minji lost track of how many pieces she played. She worked through most of the classical repertoire she knew by heart, then began taking requests. Some were familiar, popular Korean ballads she had heard on the radio. Others were Western pop songs she didn't know. But diners would hum the melodies, and after a few tries, her quick ear would pick them up. During her short breaks, Mr. Park brought her cold barley tea and small plates of food from the kitchen, delicacies she had never tasted before. The restaurant staff, who had laughed at her just hours earlier, now treated her with a mix of curiosity and respect, asking where she had studied and expressing disbelief when she repeated that she was self-taught. "My father is right over there," Mr. Lee told her during one such break, pointing to an elderly man seated at a corner table. "He was a music teacher before he retired. He hasn't stopped watching you all evening." Minji glanced over at the old man, who nodded to her with a gentle smile. She bowed her head respectfully before returning to the piano. By the time the last customers were leaving, it was past midnight. Minji's fingers ached pleasantly. and exhaustion was beginning to set in. But she felt lighter than she had in months. Mr. Lee approached with Mr. Park and the elderly man he had identified as his father. Min-ji. Mr. Lee began. This is my father, Professor Lee. He taught piano at Seoul National University for 40 years. The old professor's eyes were kind but evaluating as he looked at Min-ji. Young lady, you have something very special. A raw talent, to be sure. There are technical aspects of your playing that need refinement. But your musicality, your emotional connection to the pieces. He shook his head in wonder. In all my years of teaching, I've rarely encountered such natural ability. Min-ji bowed deeply. Thank you, sir. My son tells me you're concerned about your family's situation, Professor Lee continued. Min-ji nodded, suddenly remembering why she had come here in the first place. Her family would be worried sick. She had left that morning without explaining where she was going, and now it was the middle of the night. I need to get home, she said anxiously. My parents don't know where I am. We'll arrange transportation, Mr. Lee assured her. But first I'd like to discuss a proposition. He gestured for her to sit at one of the now empty dining tables. Mr. Park brought a pot of tea and 4 cups before joining them. We would like to offer you a regular position here, Mr. Lee said. Friday and Saturday evenings from 7 until closing. We'll pay you a fair wage plus meals while you're working. Min-ji's heart leaped. Really? You want me to play here every weekend? We do, Mr. Lee confirmed. Based on our customers' reactions tonight, your music would be very good for business. He smiled slightly. Several people asked if you would be returning. Min-ji tried to imagine it, coming to this beautiful restaurant every weekend, playing the magnificent grand piano, earning money to help her family. It seemed too good to be true. There's something else, Professor Lee said, leaning forward. If you're amenable, I would like to give you proper lessons. Once a week before your evening shift begins. Min-ji stared at him. Lessons? With you? Her voice came out as a whisper. The professor nodded. You have extraordinary potential, but there are fundamentals you've missed without formal training. Technique that would make your playing even better, prevent injury to your hands, open new possibilities. Min-ji felt tears forming in her eyes. Real lessons with a university professor, the very thing she had dreamed of but never thought possible. I can't afford, she began. Professor Lee waved a hand dismissively. We needn't worry about payment. Consider it an investment in the future. We should call your parents, Mr. Park suggested gently, noticing her overwhelmed expression. Let them know where you are and discuss the arrangements. Min-ji gave them her home phone number and Mr. Park disappeared to make the call. While he was gone, Mr. Lee explained more details about the position, the exact pay, more money than Min-ji had ever imagined earning, the possibility of additional events if she was interested, the staff meal she would receive each shift. When Mr. Park returned, his expression was both amused and sympathetic. Your mother was quite worried, he told Min-ji. I explained everything and she's relieved you're safe. But I think you may be in for quite a lecture when you get home. Min-ji winced, imagining her mother's fear when her daughter didn't return home by nightfall. Is she very angry? She seemed to calm down considerably when I mentioned the salary, Mr. Park said with a small smile. And the rice. Apparently that part of your story made quite an impression on her. By the time Min-ji finally left the restaurant, it was nearly 1 a.m. Mr. Lee insisted on driving her home himself, despite her protests that she could take the bus. The restaurant's kitchen staff had packed a large box with leftovers, enough food to feed her family for days, and Mr. Park had added a substantial bag of premium rice, winking as he handed it to her. You did ask if you could play for rice, he reminded her. We're just keeping our end of the bargain. The drive to her village took less than half an hour in Mr. Lee's comfortable car. Min-ji sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the city lights give way to darkness, then to the scattered lamps of smaller towns, and finally to the familiar outline of her village. That's my house, she said eventually, pointing to a small dwelling where a single light still burned in the window. Her heart tightened, knowing her parents had stayed awake waiting for her. Mr. Lee pulled up outside and helped her carry the food and rice to the door. Before she could knock, it flew open and her mother stood there, her face a mixture of relief and lingering worry. Min-ji, do you have any idea? Her words cut off as she noticed Mr. Lee, standing respectfully behind Minji and the packages they carried. "Mama," Minji said, her voice trembling slightly with excitement. "This is Mr. Lee. He owns the Golden Dragon restaurant in the city and—" She took a deep breath. "And I'm going to be playing piano there every weekend." Her mother's mouth opened, then closed again without speaking. She looked from Minji to Mr. Lee and back again. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Kim," Mr. Lee said with a polite bow. "Your daughter made quite an impression on our customers this evening. She has an extraordinary gift." Minji's father appeared behind her mother, looking tired but alert. Junho peered around them both, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Please come in," her father said, his natural hospitality overcoming his confusion. Inside their small home, Minji watched as Mr. Lee explained everything: the position, the salary, Professor Lee's offer of lessons. Her parents listened in stunned silence, exchanging occasional glances that Minji couldn't interpret. "So you see," Mr. Lee concluded, "your daughter came asking to play for Rice, but she's earned much more than that. She's earned our respect and admiration, and I believe this is just the beginning for her." Junho, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly burst out, "I knew it. I told you she would be famous." Minji laughed, the tension of the long, extraordinary day finally breaking. "I'm hardly famous, Junho." "Not yet," her brother insisted. "But you will be. You just wait." As Mr. Lee prepared to leave, promising to send a car for Minji the following Friday, her father walked him to the door. Minji couldn't hear what they said, but when her father returned, his eyes were suspiciously bright. He came to where Minji sat and gently placed his calloused hand on her head. "My daughter," he said softly, "it seems I've been too busy looking at the ground beneath my feet to see the stars you've been reaching for." That night, as Minji finally lay down to sleep, Junho whispered from his side of the room, "You're still going to let me be your manager when you're a world-famous pianist, right?" Minji smiled in the darkness. "Of course," she whispered back. "Who else would I trust?" She closed her eyes, her mind filled with the memory of the grand piano's perfect tone, the restaurant's appreciative silence, and Professor Lee's promise of lessons. For the first time, the future stretched before her like an open road full of possibility. "Rice," she murmured to herself, the word catching on a small laugh. "I really did play for Rice." 6 months passed in a whirlwind of changes for Minji and her family. Every Friday and Saturday evening, a black car would arrive in their village, turning heads as it made its way down the narrow dirt road to collect her. By now, the villagers knew Minji's story, the girl who had walked into a fancy city restaurant asking to play piano for Rice, and walked out with a job that was changing her family's fortunes. Her first paycheck had brought her mother to tears. They'd used it to pay off debts that had been hanging over them for months. The second went toward fixing the roof that had been leaking since the spring floods. By the third month, they were able to start saving. Junho now had new school uniforms instead of hand-me-downs, and her mother no longer had to mend the same clothes over and over. Their meals improved, not extravagant, but there was always enough, and her father didn't have to travel so far for work anymore. But the most profound change was in Minji herself. Under Professor Lee's tutelage, her playing had evolved from raw talent to disciplined artistry. Each week she arrived at the restaurant 3 hours before her shift for lessons in the empty dining room. The lessons were challenging, sometimes frustrating. Professor Lee was kind but exacting, making her repeat passages dozens of times until her fingers found the perfect position, the precise pressure needed for each note. "No, no," he would say, shaking his head. "You're playing with your fingers, not your wrists, again." Or, "Listen to what the composer is saying here. This isn't just notes on a page. It's a conversation." At first, Minji had been intimidated by his standards, worried she would disappoint him. But gradually, she began to understand what he was teaching her went beyond just playing the correct notes. "You already have the heart for this music," he told her one day. "That's the part I can't teach. But I can give you the tools to express what you feel more clearly." Tonight was special, her first formal recital. Professor Lee had arranged for her to play at a small arts center in the city, not just background music while people ate, but a proper concert where people would come specifically to hear her. The thought made her stomach twist with nerves. "Stop fidgeting," her mother scolded gently, adjusting the collar of Minji's new dress. They had splurged on it for the occasion, simple but elegant, dark blue with a modest neckline. "You look beautiful." Minji barely recognized herself in the mirror. At almost 15, she was no longer the scrawny village girl who had walked into the Golden Dragon half a year ago. Regular meals and growing confidence had changed her. Her face had filled out. Her posture had improved from hours at the piano. And today her mother had styled her hair in a way that made her look older, more sophisticated. "What if I make a mistake?" Minji whispered, voicing the fear that had kept her awake most of the night. Her mother's eyes met hers in the mirror. "Then you'll keep playing just like you keep going when life gets hard." She squeezed Minji's shoulders. "Besides, who would know? Your father and I certainly can't tell when you miss a note." Minji smiled weakly. Her parents had been supportive beyond anything she could have expected. They'd rearranged their work schedules to attend every one of her performances at the restaurant, sitting proudly at a corner table Mr. Lee always reserved for them, even though they could hardly afford the food there. Her father poked his head into the room. "Car's here," he announced. "Junho is already waiting outside, telling the driver all about how his sister is going to be world famous." The drive to the city was quiet, each family member lost in their own thoughts. Minji clutched a folder containing her sheet music, though she knew every piece by heart. Professor Lee had helped her select the program, a mix of classical works that would showcase her abilities, from Bach to Chopin to Debussy. The Arts Center was smaller than Minji had imagined, but still impressive with its gleaming wood floors and proper stage with a grand piano at its center. Backstage, she found Professor Lee waiting. "Nervous?" he asked, noting her pale face. Minji nodded, unable to speak. "Good," he said, surprising her. "Nerves mean you care. Use that energy in your playing." He patted her hand. "There's someone I'd like you to meet before you go on." He led her to a small office where a middle-aged woman sat reviewing some papers. She looked up as they entered, her sharp eyes immediately focusing on Minji. "This is Dean Park from the Seoul Conservatory of Music," Professor Lee said. "She's here to listen to you play tonight." Minji felt her heart skip a beat. The Seoul Conservatory was the most prestigious music school in the country. Students there went on to international careers, performing with orchestras around the world. "Professor Lee has told me a great deal about you," Dean Park said, studying Minji with interest. "It's not often we hear about a self-taught pianist with your level of ability." "Thank you," Minji managed to say, though her mouth had gone dry. "I've had proper lessons for 6 months now." "Yes, after teaching yourself for years," Dean Park replied. "That's what intrigues me." She glanced at her watch. "I should find my seat. Good luck tonight." After she left, Minji turned to Professor Lee with wide eyes. "The conservatory? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you'd have been even more nervous," he said simply. "Just play as you've practiced. The rest will take care of itself." Waiting in the wings as the audience filed in, Minji felt lightheaded with anxiety. She peered around the curtain and saw the small auditorium filling up, not just with her family and the Lees, but with many of the regular customers from the Golden Dragon. Mr. Park was there with several of the restaurant staff. Even Mrs. Song had made the journey from the village, sitting proudly beside Minji's parents. And in the center of the third row sat Dean Park, program open on her lap, pen poised to take notes. The house lights dimmed, and Professor Lee stepped onto the stage to introduce her. Minji barely heard his words over the roaring in her ears. Then he was gesturing toward the wings, and her feet were carrying her forward into the pool of light. The audience applauded as she bowed and took her place at the piano. The keys before her seemed both familiar and strange. She placed her trembling hands in her lap, took a deep breath, and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them and began to play Bach's Prelude in C major, something unexpected happened. The nerves that had threatened to overwhelm her channeled themselves into the music, giving it an energy, an urgency that went beyond her practice sessions. Her fingers found the keys with precision, but it was her heart guiding them now. By the time she reached her third piece, Chopin's Nocturne, the same one she had played that first night at the restaurant, she had forgotten about Dean Park, forgotten about the audience entirely. There was only the music speaking through her. The recital passed in what felt like moments. When she played the final notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune, and the last rippling arpeggios faded into silence, she sat motionless, returning slowly to awareness of where she was. Then came the applause, thunderous in the small space, people rising to their feet. Minji stood and bowed, her eyes finding her family in the audience. Her mother was wiping away tears, her father beaming with pride, and Junho was whistling with his fingers in his mouth until their mother nudged him to stop. Backstage after the recital, people crowded around to congratulate her. Professor Lee stood back, watching with satisfaction as his student received the recognition she deserved. Eventually, Dean Park made her way through the well-wishers. "Minji," she said, "I'd like to speak with you and your parents privately, if possible." They found an empty practice room where Dean Park came straight to the point. "The conservatory would like to offer you a scholarship to study with us starting next term." Minji's parents exchanged glances of amazement. Her mother found her voice first. "That's very generous, but we live quite far from Seoul. The commute would be difficult." "It's a boarding scholarship," Dean Park clarified. "Room, meals, tuition, all covered." Minji would live at the school during term time, returning home for holidays. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Minji looked at her parents, reading the conflict in their eyes. Pride in this opportunity for their daughter mixed with the pain of what it would mean. Their child leaving home at 15. "Could we have some time to discuss this?" Her father asked quietly. "Of course," Dean Park said, "but I should mention that places at the conservatory are highly competitive. We would need your decision within 2 weeks after she left." The three of them sat in silence until Minji's father reached out and took his daughter's hand. "This is what you've been working toward, even when none of us realized it," he said softly. "A chance like this." "But you need me at home," Minji said, thinking of her weekend earnings that had become so important to the family budget. "The money from the restaurant has helped us get back on our feet," her mother finished for her. "But we managed before and we can manage again." She squeezed Minji's other hand. "This isn't about us. This is about your future. But living away from home, I've never been away from you, from the village." The thought was terrifying and thrilling all at once. Her father smiled sadly. Sometimes the most painful thing a parent can do is let their child go. He straightened his shoulders. "But that's our burden to bear, not yours." Minji's thoughts whirled. The conservatory would open doors she had never imagined possible. She would study with the finest teachers, play music she had only dreamed of mastering, perhaps even perform internationally someday, but it would mean leaving behind everything familiar, her family, her village, the community center piano where it had all begun, even the Golden Dragon where she had found her first audience. She would be surrounded by students who had been training formally since they were small children, who came from families that could afford the best instruments and opportunities. "What if I'm not good enough?" she whispered, giving voice to her deepest fear. "What if I get there and they realize I don't belong?" "Minji," her mother said firmly, "you asked to play for rice when our family was hungry. That same courage will carry you through whatever challenges come next." She tucked a strand of hair behind Minji's ear. "Besides, you heard the applause tonight. You belong wherever music is valued." Later that night, as the family drove home in the car the conservatory had provided, Minji watched the city lights give way to darkness, just as they had on that first night 6 months ago. But this time, instead of triumph, she felt a bittersweet ache in her chest. Change was coming again, bigger than before. Part of her wanted to cling to what was known and safe. But another part, the part that had given her the courage to walk into the Golden Dragon and ask to play for rice, was already reaching toward the new horizon opening before her. 6 years passed, like the turning pages of a well-loved book. Minji stood at the window of her Seoul apartment, watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk settled over the skyline. At 21, she was no longer the village girl who had once asked to play piano for rice. She was now Minji Kim, rising star of the classical music world, fresh from a European tour that had earned her standing ovations in Vienna, Paris, and London. Tomorrow she would return to her village for the first time in nearly a year. Her concert schedule and studies had kept her away longer than usual, with only video calls to bridge the distance. She missed her family with an ache that success couldn't diminish. Her father's quiet wisdom, her mother's practical strength, and Junho's boundless enthusiasm. Now 19, her brother was studying business at university, determined to make good on his childhood promise to manage his sister's career one day. Minji's thoughts drifted back to her years at the conservatory. Those first months had been among the hardest of her life. The other students, most from wealthy families, had been trained at prestigious academies since they were tiny. They spoke a musical language filled with terms Minji had never heard, played instruments worth more than her family's house, and carried themselves with the confidence of those who had always belonged. In those early days, she had often cried herself to sleep in her dormitory room, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. The technical gaps in her training seemed insurmountable. One teacher had even suggested she might consider a less demanding program. But Professor Lee, who continued to mentor her, had refused to let her give up. "You have something many of these students will never have," he told her. "When you play, people listen not just with their ears but with their hearts. Technique can be taught. What you have is inborn." Slowly, painfully, Minji had closed the gaps in her knowledge. She practiced longer hours than anyone, her light often the last burning in the practice rooms. The calluses on her fingertips grew thick, and sometimes she soaked her hands in warm water at night to ease the aches. But gradually, her natural talent combined with her newfound technical skill, and her professors began to take notice. In her third year, she had won the National Young Artist Competition, which came with a cash prize that allowed her to send money home regularly. By her fifth year, international invitations began arriving. And now, just 1 year after graduation, she had completed her first European tour. A knock at her apartment door pulled Minji from her memories. She opened it to find Hae-jin, her friend from the conservatory and now her roommate. "I brought dinner," Hae-jin said, holding up bags of takeout. "Figured you'd be too busy packing to cook." They sat at the small kitchen table, sharing the food and talking about Minji's upcoming trip. "I have a surprise for my village," Minji said, unable to contain her excitement any longer. "I've been planning it for years." "The community center?" Hae-jin guessed. She was one of the few people Minji had told about her idea. Minji nodded. "The paperwork went through last week. The Minji Kim Foundation for Musical Education is officially registered." She still felt strange saying her own name as part of the foundation. "The construction starts next month. They're going to be so proud," Hae-jin said, squeezing her friend's hand. "From playing for Rice to funding a music school. It's like a movie." Minji smiled, but her heart felt suddenly heavy. "I just wish Mrs. Song could have seen it." The elderly woman who had first allowed her to play the old upright piano had passed away 2 years earlier. Minji had flown home for the funeral, playing Bach at the service in tribute to the woman who had given her first access to a piano. "She knew what you would become," Hae-jin said gently, "even before you did." The next morning, Minji was on a train heading for her village. She watched the sprawling city thin out into smaller towns, then farmland, and finally the familiar hills that cradled her childhood home. So much had changed, yet this landscape remained essentially the same. Her parents and Junho were waiting at the station, waving excitedly as she stepped onto the platform. Her mother's hair had more gray now and her father moved a bit more slowly, but their embraces were as warm as ever. "Look at you," her mother said, holding Minji at arm's length. "So elegant. You look like you belong on television." "She has been on television, Mom," Junho reminded her, rolling his eyes but smiling. "Multiple channels, multiple countries." They laughed together as they walked to the car, a modest but new vehicle her father had purchased last year with Minji's help. As they drove through the village toward home, Minji noticed small changes. New roofs on old buildings, a paved road where dirt had once been, several unfamiliar shops. "The village is doing well," her father commented, noticing her observations. "That new housing development finally brought some business our way instead of just taking our farmland." They passed the community center, and Minji felt a tug at her heart. It looked smaller than she remembered, its paint faded in places. Soon, if her plans went accordingly, it would be transformed into a proper arts center with practice rooms, performance space, and most importantly, good instruments accessible to any child with interest, regardless of their family's means. At home, Minji found her old room preserved almost exactly as she had left it 6 years ago. Her childhood book still on the shelves, the faded poster of her favorite pianist still on the wall. The only new addition was a framed copy of her first professional album cover. That evening, neighbors and old friends stopped by, eager to see the local girl who had become an international musician. Minji answered their questions patiently, played a few pieces on the small digital keyboard her parents had purchased after she left for the conservatory. and signed copies of her album for those who had brought them. When the last visitor had gone, Minji sat with her family around the kitchen table, just as they had done throughout her childhood. The setting was familiar, but she was keenly aware of how much had changed, not just in her circumstances, but in herself. "I have something to tell you," she said, suddenly nervous despite having rehearsed this moment in her mind for months. "I've started a foundation." She explained her plan to rebuild the community center as a music school, provide scholarships for talented students from rural areas, and ensure that no child with a passion for music would be held back by poverty. She described the practice rooms, the concert hall, and most importantly, the 10 new pianos, including a concert grand for performances. "The foundation will cover all operating costs and staffing," she concluded. "I've already hired a director, Professor Lee's daughter, who is a music educator, and we'll have visiting instructors from the conservatory." Her parents and Junho stared at her in amazement. "Min-ji," her father finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "When you first told us you wanted to play piano at that restaurant, I thought you were just being a dreamy child. Even when you got the scholarship, part of me worried you were reaching too far beyond our world." He shook his head slowly. "I should have had more faith in what you could become." "We always knew you were special," her mother added, reaching across the table to squeeze Minji's hand. "But to give back to the village this way, it's because of you," Minji said earnestly. "You let me go when it would have been easier to keep me home. You supported my dream even when it meant sacrifice for our family." She looked at each of them. "Now I can make sure other children have the same chance." The next morning, Minji woke early. While her family still slept, she slipped out and walked through the quiet village to the community center. Using the key the caretaker had given her years ago, she let herself in. The main room was empty, chairs stacked against the walls, dust motes dancing in the shafts of early sunlight streaming through the windows, and in the corner stood the old upright piano where everything had begun. Minji approached it slowly, running her fingers lightly over its scratched surface. The cloth that had once partially covered it was long gone. Some of the keys were chipped now, the ivory yellowed with age. She sat on the bench, adjusting it out of habit, though it could no longer be raised or lowered. When she pressed the first key, the note was slightly out of tune but still clear. She began to play Chopin's Nocturne, the piece from that first night at the Golden Dragon, letting the familiar melody fill the empty room. As she played, Minji found herself thinking of the long journey from this spot to the grand concert halls of Europe and back again. She thought of Mrs. Song, of Professor Lee, of Mr. Park and the restaurant staff who had once laughed at her request to play for rice. She thought of Dean Park and her teachers at the conservatory. But mostly she thought of her family, their unwavering belief in her even when her dreams seemed impossible. The final notes of the nocturne faded into silence. Minji sat for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the keys of the old piano. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded set of architectural plans. Spreading them on top of the piano, she studied the detailed drawings of what this space would become. A place where other children would discover music, perhaps find their own voices. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty room, to the old piano, to everyone and everything that had brought her to this moment. Outside, the village was coming awake. Minji gathered the plans and stood, taking one last look at the humble piano that had started her on this path. Soon it would be moved to a place of honor in the new building, a reminder of beginnings and possibilities. As Minji stepped into the morning sunlight, she smiled at the thought of the next village child who might discover music here, not having to ask to play for rice, but finding doors already open, opportunities already waiting. The story that had begun with her wouldn't end with her. It would continue through all the young musicians who would come after, their own melodies adding to the ongoing composition of dreams realized and lives transformed.